I'm just finding my like footing at the moment, but really enjoying it so far. So today we're joined by two special guests. We've got Rebecca Lockwood and Emily Jane Heap, and we're going to talk about the impact of being working class as a journalist, the lack of socioeconomic diversity within the industry, and sort of different routes into journalism as a working class journalist. So I thought it'd be good to sort of start by both of you introducing yourselves, just as me and Lauren have done, and talking about like your individual journeys into journalism, and maybe just more broadly what sort of both of your educational backgrounds look like. So should we start with Emily?
Sure. Jane. Most people call me EJ though, because Emily Jane's a bit of a mouthful, so it's a little bit I think I've always known that I wanted to be a journalist, probably since I was about 14, which is, I think, quite unusual to know that young, sort of what you want to do and to be set on that path. Obviously, coming from a working class background, I knew that it was going to be harder for me than it would be for other people hoping to embark on that career path, because I think I was quite aware that journalism, obviously I saw you put some stats out about sort of how dominated the industry is by people from sort of middle class backgrounds and people that perhaps have a little bit more money, but yeah, I sort of just wanted to start by saying it is possible to get there from a working class background, as both myself and Rebecca have demonstrated, and lots of other journalists too. So it's obviously a bit more difficult, but it is possible. So me personally, the way I got into journalism, I started off when I went to Exeter University and did an English degree, and whilst I was there, I sort of thought, well, if this is a career, probably the best thing to do is get involved in student media. And I think that regardless of your like socioeconomic background, I think that student media is probably the best place to start for absolutely anybody. And so same as Rebecca, and that's actually how we know each other. We both got involved with the tab, and I couldn't recommend it enough. It's a really nice bunch of people. They're really welcoming, and they've got like a HQ that will support you, so it's not just like you're not thrown in at the deep end. So I started off by sort of volunteering to write for them and doing some very basic stuff to begin with, and I started to get given more and more responsibilities, and then eventually they asked if I'd be the editor for the Exeter branch of the tab. And yeah, I really can't recommend that enough, because it was something that I could build around my studies. It didn't really, I wouldn't say it took up too much sort of extra time on top of what I was already doing, because obviously you've got to focus on academics, but it really gave me that sort of foot in the door in the industry and the experience that I needed to sort of start looking for those first kind of proper work experience placements and jobs and things like that.
Yeah, I already know Rebecca because I sort of took over the tab Lancaster from her, so it's great to hear how what people's experiences have been like at different branches and stuff like that. So Rebecca, over to you, I guess, to tell us about your background.
Yeah, hi, I'm Rebecca, but again, I'm more of a Beck. I'm from a place called Cannock, which is in the Black Country in the West Midlands, and went to state school, did my A-levels, and went to Lancaster Uni to do English and creative writing. A bit unlike him, I really had no idea that I wanted to be a journalist at all. And I like to say, like, I kind of fell into it through student media. I could never find my extracurricular thing. I knew I enjoyed writing, and the tab gave me a space to write features and lifestyle, which is kind of what I wanted to do. And I guess just carried on. I started doing that at the end of my first year and carried it all the way to my final year. I was editor-in-chief for just under 2 years, I think, in the end. But kind of echoing what was said, it was just a great experience, and you are so hands-on. You get all these responsibilities and all these kind of this network of other people, young journalists like you, so that you can talk and you can learn almost on the job, but not really, because you are volunteering. But it was just invaluable, really, and it is kind of how it led to the beginning of my career, just through talking to people outside of the tab and interacting that way. So that's where I'm at. I feel like I just said a load of words there, but I hope that made some sense.
No, yeah, it did definitely, and it actually tangents quite nicely into the next question, which was that obviously neither of you had kind of a straightforward journey into journalism, both in different ways when we've spoken. I know, Rebecca, you were quite keen to highlight perhaps a non-traditional route into the industry, having not completed a master's. And Emily, I know you were awarded the MCTJ's Journalism Diversity Fund. So it'd be great to hear about those processes in a bit more depth, and to maybe reach more broadly and discuss other options available to those who might not be able to afford the more traditional route. If we start with Rebecca.
Yeah, I love my story into journalism because it feels like quite a fun one. I'll try and tell it as quickly as I can, really. When I was the editor of Lancs Tab, the Lancaster branch of it, there was a break in the Wetherspoons of norovirus, and it was really grim, and we broke the story. It just so happened that I went to Wetherspoons that morning, saw that it was closed, sent off a comment, and we broke it, which was amazing. And obviously when you're a student journalist or you're in student media, it's just amazing to have been the team that have done that. And obviously local news sites caught on, etc. And I noticed that one of the regional sites used our picture, and I was like, I can't believe they've done it. I matched it up, like it was exactly, there was a reg plate in it, and I was like, it's exactly our photo. You haven't asked permission, you haven't credited. And I sent the editor a message on Facebook just being like, you best credit us or remove it, else I'm going to sue you, because I thought that would, I wanted the credit more than anything, because I feel like that happens so often with student journalists and stuff. And I just messaged him, we sorted it all out, and obviously I was never going to pursue a legal battle against him, but and about 6 months later he emailed me and asked if I wanted to do a placement with Lancs Live, and I couldn't take it up at the time. I said like, oh, I'm still in my final year, I don't have time to do it. And then 6 months after that he came back again and asked me to do it, and then I started doing casual work for them, full-time casual, and then I interviewed, and then I got my first job. And as much as I think, wow, I was so lucky to have someone remember who I was, I still think there's something to be learned there in networking and making sure you push your name out a little bit. I don't think I realised I was doing it, and I think at the time I was saying quite loudly how angry I was about the whole interaction, but I didn't realise I was kind of saying, no, you will know who I am. I work really hard and I want to be credited for that. So to be rewarded for that confidence was really nice, and I think that's there's something to be taken from it.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like the passion of like, no, you will not use my photograph, and like actually putting yourself out there, like you said, even though you did it on a whim, it was having, like you said, the confidence to email and say, look, this needs to be done and it's not fair. And they obviously really liked that. Yeah, Emily, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I sort of absolutely want to echo what Beck said there about putting yourself out there, because it was actually sort of a very similar story for me. We broke, at the Tab Exeter, we broke a big story on a racism scandal on a student. It was one of those Facebook confessions websites. I think most universities have them. And essentially the admins have been letting through sort of Nazi propaganda. It was really awful. And we broke it first, and it actually ended up getting picked up by sort of local media like BBC sites and some of the national papers. And through that, obviously the local papers were starting to take interest, and because we were the only people that had covered it, they were all sort of starting to get in contact with me, and I had a really nice journalist actually from the BBC who rang me up, and he basically wanted to get the story out of me, but as a way of sort of thanking us for our help, he sort of he decided that he would actually credit Tab in the piece, and actually spoke to me and got a quote from me about the situation, because he said, well, as a student, you're probably the expert on this. He said, I don't really understand how these groups work. So through that, I also ended up getting my name mentioned in the BBC article. And as a result of that, about a month down the line, I got a message on LinkedIn from one of the editors and the managing editors at Vice, and she said that they were looking for local journalists down in the southwest to do some reporting on. It was in 2019, so it was the time of the general election, and they were looking for people to report on constituencies that had the possibility of a swing vote. So, you know, going to be a dramatic change in the party in control, and yeah, she basically said, sort of, all expenses paid, trip down to Cornwall, would you write 2 articles for us? Obviously I jumped at the chance. Like, I remember getting the message on LinkedIn and sort of like screaming down. I was walking on the way to my lecture thinking, oh my god, this is someone from Vice, and obviously that was a result of sort of putting myself out there and making sure that we got the credit for that story that we broke with the Tab. And then obviously that led to someone seeing my name out there, and after that I kind of just I obviously did some pieces for them, and I made sure I stayed in contact with that editor, and I continued to pitch pieces to her, and did sort of a bit of freelance work with Vice on the side, and I also did a week's work placement with Devon Live in Exeter, and I was quite lucky at the time that they still had offices, and now all the Reach sites are all it's all done remotely, so it wouldn't be quite the same now, but I managed to get week's work experience with them, and I think that was sort of really what solidified for me that this was the career that I wanted to go into, and it was sort of the combination of that work experience and the stuff that I did with Vice. I thought, this is really exciting, like this is definitely something that I want to pursue in the future. And obviously, as I was coming to the end of my degree and my end of the time with the Tab, I was starting to think about how I could sort of take that one step further and actually make a career out of this. And I did some research, and I ended up applying to, on a bit of a whim, the Daily Mail's graduate scheme. And I made it to the very final stage, and there was a really lovely, I can't remember her name, but it was a really lovely lady interviewing, and she said to me, she said, you've basically got everything we want, but you haven't got an NCTJ, and that's what's holding you back. And I think it was obviously because I wasn't particularly experienced at the time, and so she recommended that I go to News Associates in Twickenham, which is the like #1 sort of school of journalism in the UK. And so I did some research into that and decided that would be my path in. And I applied, got an interview, and ended up getting a place. And I really started to think about, this is going to cost me a lot of money, because NCTJs, they're a great way into journalism, but they do cost, I think it's the News Associates one was about £4,000, which obviously for some people is nothing, but for me that was a hell of a lot of money. And so I was starting to think about ways of actually getting that money, and what I decided to do was to start the course in February, rather than, I think the other option was September. And so I decided to take 6 months and just work at Waitrose, my local supermarket, and just save up as much money as I could. And I don't think there's any shame in doing anything like that. I think a lot of people think that you've got to go straight into the job, and that, you know, sort of doing anything else in the meantime is going to hold you back, and it really doesn't. I don't, like, that was like 6 months of my life where I saved up all this money, and I don't think it held me back at all. But then I also, as you mentioned earlier, I got very lucky that I spotted the Journalism Diversity Fund, and I initially, when I saw that, I thought that, I think when you hear the word diversity, a lot of people just assume that it's to do with race or religion. And I thought, sort of, as a white person, that's not for me. And so I sort of didn't really look at it. And I think it kept getting mentioned in the process of, obviously, because I was I'd been given a place at News Associates. They kept sort of encouraging people to apply to this, and I thought, well, I'll have a look at it and see what the conditions actually are. And one of their big sort of clauses was that they really support working class journalists. And I thought, well, what's the worst that can happen? I might as well give it a go and apply. And so, yeah, I got my application together and had to do an interview for that, which was quite daunting, and explain sort of why the career was so important to me and why I needed the money for it. And I actually ended up being given the full grant for the course, which was incredible, because then that meant that I could spend the money that I'd earned up at Waitrose, saved up at Waitrose, I could spend that on my travel to and from London. And it was just a huge weight off my shoulders. So yeah, I would highly recommend, if you get the opportunity, if the NCTJ is the route that you want to take, I would definitely recommend looking into the Journalism Diversity Fund. And they're a really lovely bunch, and they continue to support you even after you've obtained your NCTJ. They give you a mentor, someone to sort of help you navigate the industry. It's a fantastic, really fantastic route in. So yeah, would highly recommend that. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble.
No, I think that was like so valuable, because I mean, to be honest, until I started putting these workshops together and helping like find people and stuff like that, like I personally hadn't even, I'd heard of doing an NCTJ, and I had heard of News Associates, but I hadn't got much further than that. And I suppose, like you say, like kind of stumbling upon it, or like being lucky enough to have someone like point it out to you, like a lot of the time there's not much there, but a lot of the time there is stuff there, and it's difficult to actually find it. So it's kind of really valuable to hear how you went about it. But the next thing I kind of wanted to ask is about sort of taking advantage of like internships and voluntary positions, because obviously you guys both we did work for the tab, but worked unpaid for the tab for the most part while at university. And I particularly wanted to talk about that. Like, I know you said earlier, Emily, that it didn't take up like too much of your time, but obviously like there is some of that where it means like getting a part-time job or whatever might be a bit more limited on what hours you can do. And I know, like for myself, like currently now, like looking at part-time jobs while I'm on my year off since finishing uni, there's a lot of like voluntary stuff I'm doing, and it's quite difficult to explain to employers like, I don't know if I can do this day because something like I usually do this on here, but you've not got like concrete hours to like explain that kind of thing. And I just wanted to say as well about was there anything that you had to sort of turn down financially? I know the tab internship, the one at HQ, is in London. For me personally, when I did mine, it was moved online, remote, because of COVID. And I think personally, if that hadn't have happened, that I definitely wouldn't have been able to afford it. And there's some things that like I myself have had to like turn down or whatever. So I didn't know, I don't know if you'd had any similar experiences, that kind of thing. Go to Emily first.
Sure, yeah, no, it's definitely unpaid internships are a really tricky thing to navigate, and unfortunately it is something that in the world of journalism you can't avoid, and I wish you could. It would be fantastic if people would pay, but unfortunately that never seems to be the way. In terms of the tab, to start with, so I think it's one of those things where I think that if you're going to go into this industry, it's probably sort of worth recognizing that it is going to be a lot of hard work, and I think that most people that go into journalism are quite driven people. It's a tough industry to get into, and you sort of have to have that drive. And I think that you know it does sort of also need to start with when you're going with like student media. I wouldn't say it wasn't too much on top of my, like it wasn't an unbearable workload on top of my academic work, and I think that the team at the HQ, I don't know how Beck found it, but I found that it was quite manageable to they were good, basically the team were good at managing your sort of workload so that it wasn't all getting on top of you. And I had when I was the editor-in-chief at the Tab Exeter, I had a sort of co-editor, so there were two of us, and they split the role, because I think before me it was just the one editor, and they realized that it was getting like a lot of work just for one person, so they split the duties between two of us, and that way, sort of, if one of us needed to work, or one of us had academic stuff that was taking priority, we sort of worked quite nicely together to be able to say, look, could you do this part today and I'll do that tomorrow, or I'll take this week's meeting, you take next week's meeting, and I think we were quite good at sort of getting that nice balance. And then in terms of sort of outside of student media, it is really difficult, and I will have to say that I am very lucky in the sense that I live in the southeast, so I was able to commute into London. It is still tricky because even that is a huge added expense, and I think that's another barrier, not just in terms of sort of socioeconomic factors, but also if you live outside of London, getting a placement at sort of one of the national papers, or even something like the Tab, the HQ, is really tricky because you've obviously got that travel barrier as well. Not everyone can afford to come and stay in London. So in that respect, I was lucky that even though I wouldn't have been able to afford to stay in London, I could afford to commute up to London. And it's a hard one because I think that there's it is tricky trying to find a way around this. But I definitely would say that not every internship or every kind of placement will be unpaid. You sort of have to shop around a bit. Like I mentioned earlier, I got very lucky that with Vice, they actually paid very, very well, and that's how I could afford to do that. And they obviously paid the expenses to go down to Cornwall and to write those two stories. And I would highly recommend, if you've got sort of ideas for articles, particularly sort of feature pieces, pitching them to places like Vice and Dazed. They're very receptive to sort of young journalists who don't have much experience, and there's a lot of websites. I can't think of off the top of my head of sort of where I first pitched to, but there are a good few websites that are very willing to sort of take a chance on young and inexperienced journalists, and Vice is one of them, so I would recommend. And that's obviously a great foot in the door because they're a very well respected company, and it's a really good experience. So there are ways around it, but it is tricky, and unfortunately I don't have all the answers to that one.
No, I think what you said about pitching and having I suppose sort of knowing your target market in a way, if that's what you're thinking about it, like pitching to publications that are receptive, as you say, to young people or people of different backgrounds and stuff like that, definitely. Rebecca, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, it is really tricky, and I was exactly the same. All the work and internships that I had done, and I didn't do many, it was mostly Tab. It was all unpaid until I started working casually, which felt like, oh my gosh, there was no way I was going to turn it down, because what an amazing opportunity. But I think something that I really want to say now that I'm working is there's a side to this with unpaid work and unpaid internships that can be really, what is the right word, like it really demotivating, because you know you're good and you know you can write, and you know that what you're doing is worth being paid for, and you know you have the CV and you have the talent to be paid for that work. And there can come to a point where you feel like, I've had enough of this now. Like, when am I going to get past this? What feels like a requirement, and it does come, is what I want to say, because all of it can feel like quite swampy. Like you say, you can research internships and grants and this option or an NCTJ option or everything. There's so many ways in that you can start to feel stuck. But what I'm saying is, it is worth it. if there is ever an opportunity that you cannot afford to get to, like the ones in London, always just see if they will offer an online thing, an online option. I know not everyone will be like, yeah, of course, but since the pandemic, it did change a lot, and a lot of people can now work remotely. So if it is that, like with the tab, I know we keep using as an example, they changed during the pandemic. You didn't have to go down to London suddenly, you didn't have to be in the office. And as much as a brilliant experience it is to be in a newsroom, having and asking and just checking that that option exists can be very helpful. So I just wanted to kind of validate the feeling of it's really hard, it can be really tricky, is what I was trying to do there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, especially it's demoralizing, especially if you know that paid work would be a massive help if you're in a position like you're not as financially stable or stuff like that. Yeah, so wanted to move towards the topic of diversity, because it obviously underpins the whole series. It's a big question. I don't expect you to, have all the answers, but just give your opinion. Do you think the industry is doing enough to like support and empower those from a working class background, and creating a space for them, if at all, within journalism? And I'll do a two-part to the question as well, because it's probably going to be a no in many respects, especially the statistics we put up on our Instagram from a new report that came out from NCTJ. Why do you think there's been resistance to talking about class as part of diversity metrics, considering also that in these statistics it was shown that the number of upper to middle class journos actually increased from 2021 into this year? So yeah, Rebecca, if you could start, that'd be great.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky because I think my experience, I would say, when I worked regionally, it's very hard to comment on because we were all working in the northwest of England on a regional news site, and it felt very much like I was at the same playing field as everyone else in that newsroom, outside of the fact I was a trainee and other people were more senior. In my most recent role, I would say that has definitely changed, and I'm very much in a minority of working class northern background. I really hold on to the line that I think there's a shift in who audiences want to hear from. And in order to cater to that, they have to employ and hear from the voices of working class writers and diverse people from different backgrounds. Because you can't tell a story if that's not where you're from, essentially, is what I'm trying to say. So I am hopeful that that will change, and it is changing. I think even the type of content that we want, when it's like from the cost of living crisis, is a great example, is going to land much better when it's coming from the perspective of someone that is experiencing that and can relate to the people that they're talking to. Is where my answer is right now. I hope that is going to change. Why? I don't know. I don't know if EJ has a better answer to that.
Well, I mean, I was going to sort of echo what you said, Beck, about on terms of working at a regional level, because after my NCTJ, I worked for Kent Live, so similar to you worked for a Reach site, and I sort of started doing casual shifts for them, and then ended up getting a full-time job there. And at that level, and again with my NCTJ, I definitely think there's an effort to make the workforce more diverse, which is really, really reassuring. And like, for instance, with the NCTJ, obviously they were pushing that journalism diversity fund and getting in more people from working class backgrounds. And then on the regional level, again, yeah, I felt like we were all sort of a level playing field, and most people came from relatively ordinary backgrounds. And I think as well that was a lot of that was because there was a diversity in age as well, and you had people who'd been working at these papers for a long time who actually hadn't even gone to university, and they'd really gone in sort of at the bottom of the rung and then worked their way up at these papers. And unfortunately, I do think that now I now work for a press agency, so we do stuff for the national papers, and I think that having taken that step up, I've seen the massive sort of gap between local and national papers, and not even just in terms of sort of class and sort of race diversity and things. I think as well, I remember recently I walked into a job, it was quite a horrible story. I'm not sure if anyone heard about it, but East Kent Hospitals Trust, they basically had a horrific track record for their maternity services, and several women and a lot of babies died because of their sort of neglect, essentially. And it was a big report on this, and I went to the press conference and I walked into the room and I was basically essentially the only person in there that wasn't a middle class man. And it was quite daunting, like being the only woman in the room, and looking around me and thinking, oh my god, like, am I sort of out of place? Do I belong here? And I sort of had I got imposter syndrome a bit, but I had to tell myself, actually, just because there's a problem with the industry does not mean there's a problem with me being here. Like, I wouldn't be here if my boss didn't think I was perfectly capable of reporting on this. And, you know, we had orders from several of the national papers, and some of my copy was used in those national papers. And I had to sort of tell myself, actually, no, you are capable. Why does that person being a middle-aged man make them any better at their job than you? And it doesn't. And obviously that doesn't answer the question of how we can improve the industry and make it more diverse. Unfortunately, I think that that's something that me on my own not going to be able to achieve. But I think that you do have to really sort of tell yourself, when you feel imposter syndrome, that no, you do belong there. You've worked just as hard as everyone else, and you're just as capable as everyone else, or otherwise you wouldn't be there. So yeah, I think that's probably my answer to that big question.
Yeah, I kind of feel like there's almost like two sides to it in a way, because I definitely think, like, in the current like economic and like political climate, that working class journalists can perhaps like resonate with a broader readership than those more privileged people can. And so there's definitely, I mean, I think there's always a value of having more diversity in a workplace, but I think especially now, like, working class voices are being like heard a lot more. But in the other workshops we've done so far, a lot of the panelists have mentioned like experiences of tokenism and sort of the tick box approach of like having people in the room, and then when that kind of story comes up, that it's always like, oh, that's for Rebecca, or that's for Emily, and it kind of gets like funneled towards you, and like you kind of become a voice in the room, but sometimes perhaps the only voice in the room, and that might be like all you start writing about. So have you guys ever experienced tokenism yourself, or have you found that you're sort of treated as more of like a valuable voice in the room or something like that? We'll start with Rebecca.
Is that me? Sorry, I didn't hear you.
Oh, sorry, did it cut off? Yeah, I said start with Rebecca, sorry.
Aggressively nodding to that, and I don't know how I feel about it, because you're exactly right, and it does happen. I mean, I remember I once did like a big piece on why we shouldn't call people chavs, and I noticed that after that I was quickly asked if I wanted to do things on food poverty and etc., and I realised that pattern, and I didn't know how I felt about it, because part of me thinks absolutely yes, do ask me, I really want to talk about these things, and then another part of you thinks, how much of my own experience and my own whatnot do I have to give up in order to receive this, you know, job, what I'm doing, what I'm writing. That's tricky, and I'd like to say that I don't experience it as much anymore, but I know that because now I work in video and content creation, I know my accent is important to the job that I have, and I know that being a northern or whatever Brummie voice is good for my company, if that makes sense. How I feel about it, I don't know. I really don't know the answer. I don't know whether to feel, whether to look at it negatively or positively. I don't know if anyone could help me with that.
Emily, do you have an answer to that question yourself, or?
It is a tricky one. I think that I've actually been very lucky that I don't think I don't want to say fallen into that trap, because that's obviously not the right expression, but I've seen it happen to other people, particularly on Twitter, people that, you know, sort of people that I've worked with in the past, I've seen have perhaps if they've got a disability, or if they're from like a working class background, they sort of get sucked into that I don't know how to describe it, but you see that they end up writing a lot of, and obviously if it's your personal choice, it's absolutely fine, but I notice a lot of people get pressured into writing about very personal experiences to them based on sort of their diversity, and it does make me quite uncomfortable sometimes, because I think that sometimes you can see that they've obviously been offered that opportunity by a company, you know, that's obviously got a good reputation and a good name, and you know, they're very sort of enthusiastic to get their name out there, but at the same time that involves sharing things that are quite personal to you, and I think that that's something definitely to be aware of, and don't feel pressured into sort of succumbing to that if it's not something you're comfortable with. Obviously if it is, that's absolutely fine. If sort of sharing your personal experiences is something that you're more than happy to do, that's, you know, that's perfectly okay, because people want to hear them. But I think it's something to be aware of, that people will take advantage of that and try and use it against you. But no, in terms of me personally, I think that I have been quite lucky that the places I've worked at, particularly where I work now, I've always been treated with respect and you know, as equal to my colleagues, which is really nice. And I think a lot of that is to do with sort of having that confidence yourself, and going into the job knowing that you're capable of it, and sort of, you know, putting your foot down, and if you're not treated equally, don't let people walk all over you. I know it's easier said than done, but you do have to sort of have your own back as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. I mean, in the other workshops, we've been talking about how when you come from a underrepresented group, it's so hard to strike that balance between writing what you want because you like it and you're passionate about it, but also kind of feeling that responsibility almost to talk about working class experience and keeping that representation. So it is difficult, I get. In terms of earlier, you guys talk a lot about working for regional, more local publications. I was wondering why, in your opinion, perhaps local news is so important to the coverage of working class issues and making sure that there is coverage of underrepresented communities within the media. Within this, it would be great if you could maybe share some of your experiences covering these kinds of stories, and just about local news in general. We could go with Becca, that'd be great.
Yeah, it is really, really important, and I don't actually think I truly realised how vital regional news is until I worked in it. I think there's something really, really personal about it, where the people that you meet are pretty much, it could be absolutely anyone. And working in Lancashire, I was covering areas like Burnley, Blackburn, Blackpool, which are very deprived areas. There's a lot. I remember the worst one I ever went to was a housing estate, literally a stone's throw from Blackpool Tower. There's a huge divide in Blackpool between tourism and living. And I was speaking to a woman there, and she was talking about how living there was worse than being on trial for murder. And it was just so grim. And we went through this tour of the housing estate, but being able to stand there with her and hear her and tell her story and be able to say, no, we can do something about it. The council aren't going to be able to ignore what you're saying to me, made me realise, wow, this is really important. Like, these are people's real lives. These are things that you can drive past, or you might just, you know, it could be the street across from where you're living. You feel so close to people's real life and personal life and when you see that change, there's nothing, it's so rewarding. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think also having that kind of, not first-hand experience, because you're not going to be able to relate to everyone's stories, but having just the ability to empathise with people as well, that maybe someone from a middle to upper class background wouldn't have, consciously or not. I think that's really important. And even if you don't realise it, a lot of first-hand experiences, emotions, and yeah, your perspective is always kind of informing your writing and your voice. So yeah, I agree. Emily, if you had anything to add?
Well, yeah, no, I think local papers are hugely important. Obviously might be a bit biased to someone who's worked at one, but I think they're the first sort of they're the first point of call for, you know, when people are concerned about things in their area. And local papers really are sort of the voice for people who don't really have anyone else to go to. You know, I think that things that perhaps might not get picked up at a national level because they're not deemed interesting enough, but they're still incredibly important to people at a local level. And I think people, forget how crucial local papers are. Even now, working for a press agency, so sort of our remit is the national papers, we still get a lot of our stories from the local papers. We'll see things that have been picked up in the local papers because, you know, they paid attention to, like, listening to people when people message in or call in or give them tips, and then we'll go, actually, that's a fantastic story, and that's something that should be amplified to a national level because it's really important. But, you know, even things that don't make the national papers, it doesn't mean they're not important. Local papers really are a fantastic way of amplifying people's voices. I think one that I'll always remember, when I worked at Kent Live, there was a farm for it was called Princess Christian's Farm. It was actually founded by Queen Victoria's daughter, and it was a farm for disabled young adults, and it basically gave them sort of their first job where they might not get employed elsewhere. They could sort of build these like life skills really, and anyway, due to lack of funding, it was the local authority was going to shut it down. So we did this big piece, and I spoke to parents who'd had children and young adults attend there, and it had really made a difference to their lives. And off the back of that, a company actually spotted the article and made the decision to invest in it, and it stayed open, and it's been open ever since. And that's something to me, that's really what journalism's all about, is actually making a difference to people's lives. So even though there's obviously a huge issue in the industry not being diverse enough, the fact that you can sort of I don't know how to word it, but I feel like local papers do a huge, fantastic job of actually sort of supporting diversity within the local area, if that makes sense. Sorry, I probably went off on a bit of a tangent, but no, they're hugely important. They are the voice for local people.
No, absolutely. And maybe with local news, you can kind of see your impact at least a bit more like immediately than at the national level. You can see like what you have done and feel like, I don't know, you're making like a noticeable contribution. So obviously both of you have kind of gone from national to sort of bigger, sorry, gone from local to national papers. So within that, and sort of, so what was the decision like deciding to go from local to then think, okay, this job's open up at national? Was there ever a moment where you thought, no, I like kind of what I'm doing, I like being local? And have you ever sort of considered the move to London as sort of the central hub for journalism? And what was that process like? If you start with Emily.
Sure, yeah. So with me, it wasn't even so much of sort of like a choice to leave. Essentially what happened was I was working at Kent Live and really enjoying it. I love doing the local stories, and I covered the trial of David Fuller. It was a very grim one. It was a double killer and a necrophiliac. It was in all the national papers. You might have seen it. It was a bit grim, but I basically covered that and did sort of a live almost like a running commentary of the trial, which was at Maidstone Crown Court. And off the back of that, my sort of work got spotted by someone at a press agency, and that's my now boss, who offered me the job and said, look, this is a really good stepping stone. And that's actually something I wanted to talk about, was that I would highly recommend, if you're going into a local paper first, because I think they're a fantastic I mean, there's nothing wrong with spending your whole career at a local paper, but if the national papers is where you want to be, which I think is probably the case for most journalists, because obviously you do get sort of, rather than being sort of stuck reporting in one area, you get a huge, like, wide scope of things. But I think it's a really good idea to start on a local paper, because you really get that sort of grounding and that experience, and you get to cover a huge variety of things locally, which I think people don't realise. It is quite diverse. And then I think my recommendation for taking that step up to the national levels would be to go through a press agency first. I think a lot of people don't realise that's an option, and I would highly recommend that, because that sort of gives you an extra bit of grounding before you make that, which is quite a big step up, I think, from the local to the national papers. And the press agency is kind of in the middle, because you get to work for the national papers, but you sort of still got your local remit. So I'm still sort of Kent based, and we're covering Kent for the national papers, if that makes sense. So it really helps you to I guess understand, like, the difference between what a local paper and what a national paper are working for. But I also sorry, I'm going to off topic a bit, but I definitely would say, if you're thinking about applying to grad schemes at national papers, don't hold back. Don't think that, oh, I've not got the experience for it. Definitely go for it, because obviously, like I said earlier, even though I didn't actually end up getting on a grad scheme, through applying to the Daily Mail one, I got the recommendation to go to News Associates, and that was fantastic. And I also applied to the Telegraph's grad scheme, and even though I made it to the final stage of that and didn't get on, which is obviously really disappointing, I got offered shifts there, which has been fantastic and such brilliant experience, and is also a really good foot in the door. So sorry, that was a bit off topic, but definitely don't underestimate yourself, and if you want to go for it, because even just the interview experience is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said about, like, being able to sort of cover more. Like, there's something about local where you kind of become attached to the local area and stuff like that, but just having the scope to do a lot more with it's, like, obviously really exciting. Slightly conscious of the fact that we've got 5 minutes left, but don't let that startle you too much. Rebecca, do you have anything to add?
No, similar really. I suppose that I wanted to get out of local news more so because of the kind of thing I wanted to create. I wanted to try video. I'd been doing the, like, regional TikTok for a while. So when I was asked if I wanted to move over to a national social first site, it seemed quite an obvious stepping stone for me to do by that point. But I definitely agree with what EJ said, because I as well applied for a tourism writer job, which I thought sounded absolutely amazing, and got on the trainee scheme at Reach PLC. So I've not done my NCTJ or done an MA in journalism, but I'm doing my shorthand, I've done my legal, so I'll get that practice in, which is great as well.
Yeah, no, I think it's great to highlight the fact that you don't have to have done the NCTJ or an MA, and there are other routes, especially if people are worried about financial reasons. Yeah, like Eleanor said, we've only got 5 minutes left, so just wanted to round it off really with any tips you'd offer to aspiring journalists navigating the industry like yourselves and wanting to make their own impact. If we go to Rebecca and then Emily.
Yeah, my one piece of advice would be, do not underestimate your personality in any way, and don't assume that everyone is quite, what's the right word, like scarily professional. There's something really refreshing that I've found in just talking to people, whether it's in an interview or whatnot as if you know them, and that because you just come across as great, your personality's there, you're enthusiastic, and it's all about being driven, isn't it? And I think that's when it will come across, as if you're being yourself and you know what you're talking about and what you want. That will something will come back to you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Did you have any tips, Emily, that you could add?
Yeah, I think 100% do not underestimate yourself. You know, you're more than capable of doing it, and yeah, have faith in your abilities, and put yourself forward for jobs that you think look interesting. You know, pitch your ideas to newspapers, even national newspapers. If you think you've got a good idea for a story, like, pitch it. There's nothing, you have absolutely nothing to lose in that respect. And obviously, as a working class journalist, you are going to face more barriers, but it is possible. And yeah, don't give up. And it doesn't matter how long it takes you to get somewhere either. Everyone's on. I think it's very easy to compare yourself to other people, you know, similar ages of you, who perhaps gone straight onto a grad scheme and got a job at a national. I know I'm guilty of it. I look at my friends and think, oh, look, they're already working at a national, I'm way behind. But it doesn't work like that. You know, some people take 10 years to get to the job they want. Some people take a year. That's just the way life is, really. And it doesn't matter. Everyone's on a different paths, but yeah, definitely don't be afraid to sort of put yourself out there and have faith in your abilities. And yeah, so I would just say that it's always worth applying to something if you think it looks interesting, because you never know, even if you don't get that job, someone might think that, you know, someone might think that they like the look of you, or your, you know, your personality, and might offer you something later down the line, as has obviously been the case with both me and Beck. So yeah, definitely put yourself out there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think the idea of showing your personality and not being afraid to do so is really important, because nowadays I think people think it's all about your CV, it's all about, you know, what you can write down, which in part it is, but people employ people, and I think that people want someone that they're going to enjoy working with as well, which people get. So yeah, but we've only got a couple of minutes left. I don't think there's any point squeezing any more, and we've covered so much already in the hour. But yeah, thank you all for coming, and thank you to Emily and Rebecca again. You've been amazing guest speakers. And yeah, thanks to Eleanor for co-hosting as well. But yeah, that's it, guys. Thank you very much for coming again. So yeah.